Alexander the Great may have been the greatest military commander in history. At least that's what many people believe. But there's another candidate who comes close, and that's his father, King Philip II of Macedon. Many modern historians agree that Philip was actually more skilled than Alexander, but Philip didn't get the same opportunities to showcase his skills. And the stories about his victories never captured the popular imagination the way Alexander's did. One reason Philip never achieved the same level of fame as his son was that he died relatively early. Another reason was that he was assassinated just as he was poised to conquer the rest of Greece and take his campaign into Asia Minor. And a third reason was that Philip's army wasn't nearly as impressive as Alexander's. Philip's forces paled in comparison to the massive armies Alexander would field a few years later. In fact, when Philip was at the height of his power, his entire army probably didn't number more than 30,000 men. That's less than 1/10 of the size of some of Alexander's armies. So why does Philip deserve to be ranked among history's great commanders? It's because he created the supply chain that made Alexander's victories possible. Philip developed the logistical systems and military infrastructure that allowed Macedonia to project power throughout Greece and beyond. Without Philip's work, Alexander would never have been able to accomplish what he did. Let's look at Alexander's wars to see how his supply chain worked. Historians have a pretty good idea of how Alexander's supply chain operated because he and his generals wrote extensively about it. Additionally, the historian Arrian included a list of supplies each soldier was required to carry in his book, The Anabasis of Alexander. Now, unfortunately, we don't know exactly how many supplies most soldiers had. In fact, we aren't sure if the lists even applied to rank and file soldiers, or if they only applied to officers, or even if they only applied to the elite companion cavalry. Regardless, these lists do paint a picture of how Alexander's soldiers were equipped and supplied. Officers seem to have had the responsibility of making sure their troops had all the supplies they needed. A typical infantry officer might have carried extra rations for his men, extra equipment like helmets and shields, medicine for the sick and wounded, siege engines, and tools for building fortifications. The goal was for every soldier to be self-sufficient. Everyone carried enough supplies so they could travel light and move quickly. Each man was responsible for carrying his own weight and supplies, which would have varied depending on what role he played in the army. Soldiers would have hauled around about 2 days' worth of supplies, including food, water containers, blankets, tents, rope, clothing, weapons, and ammunition. Infantrymen had to carry more gear than elite cavalrymen did. In general, though, soldiers were expected to carry all the gear they needed to survive on the road and in the field and to fight battles. If someone didn't have the supplies he needed, he was expected to take them from his enemy. Now this brings us to an interesting question, which is how did Alexander manage to ensure that his army never ran out of supplies? To answer that question, let's look at a few of his campaigns. During his wars against the Persian Empire, Alexander almost always defeated numerically superior Persian forces. And he accomplished this feat despite having to cross hundreds of miles of hostile territory and sustain his army while he was there. The picture that emerges of how Alexander managed his supply chain is an interesting one. For instance, time and again, the historical sources mention that before he entered a new territory, he would receive the surrender of its ruler and arrange in advance with local officials for the supplies his army would need. If a region did not surrender to him in advance, Alexander would not commit his entire army to a campaign in that land. He would not risk putting his army in a situation where it could be crippled or destroyed by a lack of provisions. Instead, he would gather intelligence about the routes, the resources, and the climate of the region and then set off with a small, light force to surprise his opponent. The main army would remain behind at a well-stocked base until Alexander secured adequate supplies for it to follow. Whenever the army set up a new base, it looked for an area that provided easy access to a navigable river or a seaport. Then ships would arrive from other parts of Alexander's empire, bringing in large amounts of supplies. The army always stayed in its winter camp until the first spring harvest of the new year so that food supplies would be available. When it marched, it avoided dry or uninhabited areas and moved through river valleys and populated regions whenever possible so the horses could graze and the army could requisition supplies along the route. During his invasion of India in 326 BC, Alexander's supply chain faced perhaps its greatest challenge. This was his farthest campaign from any secure base, and the terrain was largely unknown. As usual, he started out with a small force and only brought a few months' worth of supplies with him. He knew his main base was more than 6 months' march away. On the plus side, he knew the route to his base fairly well, and he knew there would be some supplies available along the way. But he didn't know what kind of shape his army would be in after several months of campaigning. If his army was weakened by disease or depleted by constant fighting, his plan wouldn't work. Fortunately, his army fared pretty well, and he was able to keep it fed thanks to his supply chain. As we said, Alexander almost always tried to secure an area before committing his entire army to it. And he used the same strategy during his war against Persia. For instance, before he crossed into the Persian heartland, he occupied the coast of Asia Minor and set up a major supply base at the city of Myus. From there, he sent a message to the Persians asking for the surrender of the region west of the Halys River, and when King Darius III refused, Alexander committed his entire army to the campaign. His plan was to stay out of the interior long enough to cut off Persia's grain supply from the north and then march inland and destroy Darius's army. Of course, that's exactly what he did. Another key element of Alexander's supply chain was his use of forced marches. Time and again, he employed the ancient Greek tactic of the periplus, which involved marching day and night to reach a certain distance from the enemy and then setting up camp. There the army would rest, resupply, and prepare to fight. Alexander also used forced marches to bypass rivers that his army couldn't cross, forcing his enemies to waste time and supplies trying to stop him. Now, overall, Alexander's supply chain was efficient, flexible, and adaptive. His generals and officers understood his principles of logistics and trained the troops to follow his supply procedures. Soldiers were educated about the importance of their personal supplies and were encouraged to requisition whatever they needed to do their jobs. They knew their survival depended on it. Alexander was keenly aware of his supply chain's strengths and weaknesses, and he formulated strategies and used tactics that built upon the unique strengths that his logistics and supply chain capabilities gave him. He wisely took measures to compensate for the limitations of his supply chain. His opponents often outnumbered him and were usually fighting on their own home territory, yet their advantages were undermined by clumsy and inefficient supply chains that restricted their ability to act and limited their options for opposing Alexander's moves. In essence, Philip and Alexander built a supply chain that helped them achieve strategic goals that their armies could not have achieved on their own. Thanks for watching. Remember to give us a thumbs up if you liked this video and share it with others who might like it as well. And remember to subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Thanks.